Welcome back to the Reptile Information Review. This is a video that I've wanted to do for a while, specifically talking about technologies that are actually changing the reptile hobby right now that people might not be aware of. The first one that I want to talk about, and something that we're engaged with here, you might remember a short that was on the channel that featured electrophoresis, which is a method for visualizing PCR results. Basically, I took some of the snakes that I had here and I decided to test them on whether or not they had a het lavender albino present. Now that is just mind-blowing. The fact that we can run an experiment and genotype these animals is amazing. The second technology that I want to talk about is ultrasounds. Now, I've seen ultrasounds used the most over on mutation creation. I'm sure somebody's going to jump in the comments and say, Billy didn't invent the ultrasound. Yeah, I know that. However, personally, I've seen it over on Billy's channel the most. Now, with the ultrasounds, they're able to take snakes and optimize which snakes they're pairing together because they can tell where in the development of follicles that the animals are. So that allows them to target specific animals and not pair animals together that don't need to be paired. The genotyping project, of course, should be everywhere by now. Hopefully you've all heard of it. The one that I want to talk about specifically is the Eastern Michigan students. And of course, we did a video on this previously. I always point to the wrong side. We did a video on this previously about students over at Eastern Michigan that are under the supervision of Dr. Hannah Seidel, who are able to use PCR to identify specific traits inside of ball pythons. Now they have a whole handful, and I'm not going to quote which ones because it's always changing and it's an extremely exciting project. Herpetoculture magazine had Rare Genetics on, and Rare Genetics is able to develop some of the tests to do the same thing. And now I do want to point out that I'm going to be talking within the context of ball pythons, but there's absolutely no reason that any of the following will not also apply to something like your crested geckos or something like your corn snakes, etc., etc., etc. One of the things that the Ball Python Genetics Project found out was that certain traits like albinism actually are kind of occur within the same coding genes across different species. So this could mean that even though a test is designed to identify albino in ball pythons, it's possible, small chance, that would also be the same test that would identify albinism inside of Kenyan sand boas. We don't know, of course. And if you are a Kenyan sand boa breeder, then of course you've got bell albino, you've got the paradox albino, etc., etc., etc. So it's not going to be the identical test. And definitely if we were able to target it specific to the species, that would be perfect. But consider that this may also extend into other programs like that. And that's really exciting across the board for anybody working with reptiles right now. Just imagine if you could go test your beardies or your iguanas or your Kenyan sand boas, etc., rather than having to try to pair those animals up. Or imagine if you were able to get something like an import of a new species. Let's say abronias, for example. Let's say that you had abronias that you were able to sequence and then look in that sequence and say, I've identified, something that's kind of an anomaly, and it may happen to fall in the same region that albinism falls in for something like a ball python. Well, now you would be able to emerge albinism inside of abronia. Maybe, of course, this is all science fiction at this point in time, but it does align with our current state of science. So just because it's about ball pythons, don't think that you can kind of ignore it or that you shouldn't watch it because you specifically work with corn snakes. This type of technology is going to permeate throughout the hobby, and it's going to happen very quickly. The reason it's going to happen very quickly is because it's something that's already happened. Reptiles is always a little bit behind, and then all of a sudden we jump forward. So when it comes to gene testing animals, when it comes to making different reports of sequences of animals, this is already happening. It's already happening. We're just the last ones in line to adopt it. And once we adopt it, it is suddenly going to overnight be no one's doing this to now everybody in the entire hobby is doing this because of the accessibility that people have in jumping into something like this. Again, you can contact a company like Mini PCR. That's not the only company doing this. It's just the one that I prefer, and be able to pick up all of the equipment necessary. In my case, Mini PCR even helped me to design the test that I was working with. Actually, a better way to say that is they helped me design the protocol that I would be using to perform the test. It is slightly different than the one from the ball python genetics project, but not by much. And yeah, it worked perfectly, being able to reference the ball python genetics project, buy the mini PCR equipment, be able to go and look at YouTube videos that mini PCR has provided to help me know how to use this equipment. And then additionally, being able to work with their experts to tune that test to the equipment that I had purchased was a fantastic experience. These are events that are already happening. I'd love to tell you who, but I don't want to get in trouble. I've had a breeder just recently go ahead and text me and say, hey, by the way, the animals that you purchased from me are also het for this trait. Now, that's nothing new. In the past, people would go ahead and text each other and say, hey, I just proved this out. However, when this breeder texted me, it wasn't a matter of them proving the animal out. It was a matter of them genotyping the animal and discovering that the animal had additional traits that they weren't aware of. This is amazing news. Just think about, being a small independent breeder and you only have a few snakes. Maybe you don't have an entire facility, you just have a few snakes. Think about being able to use technologies like the ultrasound to find the specific snakes that you want to go ahead and pair. You don't have to pair them unnecessarily, and you don't have to add stress to these animals' lives by pairing them when they're not ready. Now, couple that with the idea that you'll be able to target for specific traits, let's say lavender albino, and that way you can take snakes that you have confirmed per genotyping that are lavender albino, pair those together and hit visuals faster than if you had to continuously experiment with animals to get the correct results. That is absolutely amazing. And of course, this project isn't, I would love to take credit for it. However, I did not, break the news here, but I talk about it all the time. And I've invested a significant amount of money inside, equipment to go ahead and allow me, let me not cover up the logo there. So this is a mini PCR device, obviously, but I've spent significant money to go ahead and try this at home. Just on sort of a segue, if you jump on Netflix, there's a movie called Unnatural Selection. You can go check that out to see, kind of the series of events that have led to people kind of doing biotechnology right at home. And then, of course, I'm sure you've heard of things, a little tiny thing called CRISPR. Now, we're not CRISPRing snakes anytime soon. However, in that movie, you'll be able to see where a gentleman called David Ishii, I believe, was specifically targeting the breeding of his dogs to try to produce dogs that he found more desirable. So that, of course, where the name Unnatural Selection comes from. So this is something that some people are already doing with these animals. And these innovations are not only good for money, but these innovations are also good for the ethics and welfare of keeping animals. Follow along with me for just a moment. I know that this is kind of a segue that not a lot of people will, kind of be interested in, but I think it's worth saying. So if we looked at something like the ultrasound, for example, so we're reducing exposure of two snakes to each other, which means in a way that we're also preventing the possibility of exposing those snakes to each other if those snakes are carrying diseases and their ability to transmit that disease. So it is kind of a small method for disease control. Additionally, we're not exposing those snakes to stress that they don't normally need to have. If they are not ready to breed, there's no reason for us to, cram them together, possibly, reduce their feeding, et cetera, et cetera. So the ultrasound ethically allows us to choose animals that are only ready to breed. And this is really great. Simultaneously, if we couple that with something like genotyping, then that means that we're not producing more animals than we intended to that do not have the traits that we are seeking. So that means there are fewer animals that are being produced that do not have the traits that we want, which is good. It also means that to prove out these traits, and of course, this will definitely be far down the road, but to prove out these traits, even in new genes, we wouldn't have to do something like, breeding animals back. Some people breed, offspring back to try to emerge recessive traits, and being able to use science, we can absolutely avoid that because we'll be able to say this has an anomaly in a certain area. As we engage science and sequencing and things like that in the hobby, we can say there's an anomaly here. Maybe it's worth, trying to find another animal that has the same anomaly. That way we'll emerge things like albinos, desert ghosts, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really, really, really exciting. While I was recording this, I happened to get a notification that Canova was actually doing a presentation on this exact same subject, which is amazing. Justin Kibilka over at Canova seems to be full speed ahead with engaging with this. Not only did he engage with the ball python genetics project, but I believe he's also, doing some proactive testing to see if he can identify snakes that match his breeding plans. So again, these technologies are already affecting the hobby as a whole, which is extremely exciting. Part of Canova University includes not one, but I think two videos now that are going to discuss how this is going to change the hobby. And hearing it from somebody like Justin Kibilka of Canova, of course, is much more valuable than hearing it from just a science geek like myself. I can't wait to find out exactly what he's going to say about this type of testing and how it's going to influence his plans and what his future will look like. Canova, of course, will be able to benefit from these technologies because of the number of snakes that they produce. But I definitely want to point out that also means that people that are trying to bootstrap into the hobby, people that are going to have much smaller collections that are trying to produce these animals, will be able to adopt these technologies and much more quickly get to a point where they will be able to produce desirable animals that they want to sell and animals that will do successful in the current market. There won't be any additional all normals instances because we'll be able to genotype those animals. And then there also won't be any times where we've got a male that is simply too stressed out because we've passed him between several different females who weren't ready to breed. These are amazing technologies and innovations that are not only going to be able to make breeders more money, but also get people moving into the hobby faster and able to adopt these methods to improve their breeding results, and also be able to increase the animal welfare and ethics of the hobby as a whole. Absolutely exciting.